All right, here we go, section 2.4. Geo Notes. We're going to talk about converses, inverses, and contrapositives. But we have to think back to what we did on Friday, which was 2.3 notes, and we talked about conditional statements. If, then statement. Okay, so if the car started every day, then you assume it's going to start again tomorrow, right? So the if-then statement. We called the if the hypothesis, which was the P, and we called then the conclusion, which was the Q. So if you look at this first conditional statement right here, if the car starts, then the battery is charged. The if was our hypothesis. The if the car starts, that's your hypothesis. That's our P statement. And then the battery is charged is our conclusion. That's our Q statement. So you have your if, then statement. If the car starts, then the battery is charged. And we can also use symbols. If I put P with an arrow to Q, that's telling me if P, then Q. I could also write it as if P, then Q. Same thing. So that's just more ways that we could actually write down what we want. We want a conditional statement. We want a P to Q statement. Now, there's lots of things that we can do with conditional statements. And that's what these three are called: converses, inverses, and contrapositives. The converse, let's look at the converse. The converse is formed by interchanging the hypothesis and conclusion. So it means you need to flip the statement around. If you flip it around, you get what we call the converse. Interchanging the hypothesis and the conclusion. So look at your notes and go back to the original statement, which we had right here. If the car starts, then the battery is charged. That was my original statement. So the converse would be if I flipped the statement around. So here's what the converse would be. If the battery is charged, then the car starts. So you can see how the conclusion now became the hypothesis. Hypothesis became the conclusion. You just turned it around. So basically the letters would be Q to P instead of P to Q. So if I said find me a Q to P statement, that means I'm asking you to find me a converse of a statement. Now notice this very first statement again. Look back up here again. And notice how I put true statement. That is a true statement. If the car starts, the battery had to have been charged, because the car won't start with a dead battery. So this is definitely a true statement. No doubt in my mind that that's true. This one down here is not necessarily true. Just because I had a true statement up here and I flip it around doesn't mean that this one has to be true. Now this one might be true. If the battery is charged, then the car starts. So the car's going to start just because the battery's charged? No. No, what if the alternator's not working? Or what if the starter's not working? If the battery's charged, it's still not going to start. Okay, so just because the battery's charged doesn't mean the car will start. That's not necessarily true. This is definitely true. There's no doubt in my mind that if the car starts, the battery had to have been charged. Otherwise it wouldn't have started. This one, not necessarily a true statement. Okay, so what I got here is that converses of true statements are not always true. They might be, but not always. Just because you've got a true conditional doesn't mean you have to have a true converse. The concept for you guys to make sure you understand is that converse means flip it around. That's what converse means. Just interchange the hypothesis and the conclusion, and you'll have a conditional statement. Or you'll have a converse. If you flip them around, you'll have the converse. All right, how are we doing? We good? Ready to move on? Almost. Converses of true statements are not always true. They might be true, but they don't have to be true. A converse doesn't have to be true. If the conditional is true, the converse doesn't have to be. Okay, let's move to inverse. Inverse. Here's an inverse. When the hypothesis and conclusion are both negated, meaning's negative, right? then you get the inverse of a statement. So negated means negative or not. We might put the not in front of it. The symbol that we use is the little squiggly line. So the inverse would be the squiggly line P to the squiggly line Q, which means not P to not Q, or the opposite of P to the opposite of Q. Inverse really is another way of saying opposite. Think about like negative 5. What does negative 5 really mean? It means the opposite of 5. What negative 5 would mean. So if I say find the negative of a statement, you're finding the opposite of that statement. Okay, so let's look at the inverse of our original. Now, what was the original statement again, way back at the beginning of today? If the car starts, then the battery is charged. So the inverse would be when you make them both opposites. If the car doesn't start, then the battery is not charged. So that's making them both nots. And you might notice there, that's also not necessarily true. If the car doesn't start, it doesn't mean the battery didn't have energy. It meant something else might have been wrong too. So it's not necessarily a true statement. Inverses of true statements are not always true. Converses are not always true, and inverses are not always true of true statements. Now, if our original conditional statement was false, it throws everything out of whack. It might be true again, it might be false. But when the original conditional statement is true, converses and inverses don't have to be true. They might, they don't have to be. So that would be inverse. You make them both negative. So what was converse again? Flip it around. Inverse was make them negative. Flip it around, make it negative. Guess what contrapositive is going to be? Do both. Flip it around and make it negative. So that's what contrapositives are. You're going to interchange and negate both the hypothesis and conclusion. So you did both of them. You're kind of combining the converse and the inverse together. So you're going to flip it and you're going to make it negative. So the symbols are going to look like this. Opposite of Q to the opposite of P. Or negative Q to negative P. You flipped around the P and the Q and you make them both negative. So let's think back to our original again. If the car starts, then the battery is charged. Flip it around and make it negative. Flip it around and make it negative. So the original was if the car starts, then the battery is charged. You're going to start with the battery not charged, then the car will not start. So you flipped it around and says if the battery is not charged, then the car is not going to start. And that's a true statement. If the battery's not charged, you're not going to get that car to start. So basically we could say that contrapositives will be true if the conditional statement is true. Inverses and converses don't have to be true, but contrapositives do. If you've got a true conditional, you're going to get a true contrapositive, always. And there's just one last little piece that you don't actually have to write anything down, but we do want to solve the last question there. There's one more question on there to look at. And actually, if you want to, look at that last question on your notes and bubble in what you think is the right answer. You might read it over. You might check it out, and you might bubble in which one you think is correct. While the rest of them are filling in the rest of these notes here, you might bubble in if you've already filled them in. Okay, so let's take a look at the last little problem. It says, what is the inverse of the following conditional statement, or conditional? If Jaden is at Big Slice Pizza, then he is eating pizza. What is the inverse? Do you think it's the first statement, the second one, or the third one? If Jaden is at Big Slice Pizza, then he is eating pizza. We want the inverse. What does inverse mean again? Converse is flip it. Inverse is opposite or negatives, right? So we want to make it the opposite of each statement. So if he is not at Big Slice Pizza, then he is not eating pizza. That would be the first one. So you would bubble in this first one right here. Now let's see if this works. Okay, so that is it for these notes. There are some ones on the website that I do want to show you to practice a little bit, so I'll leave the video on just so you can see them. You can review a little bit if you want to, but hopefully this will come up. Okay, here's two conditional statements. If Mel needs a xylophone, then she is going to take music lessons. That's the first one. If she needs a xylophone, then she's going to take music lessons. If Mel is going to take music lessons, then she needs a xylophone. Is the second statement the converse, the contrapositive, or the inverse of the first one? Okay, so remember, inverse makes them negative. Converse flips them around. So you think converse. So we'll put that in, and good job. It was right. What is the inverse of the following conditional? If Blake is not playing bridge, then Blake is not happy. Read it over. We'll take a vote here in a second on what you think is the inverse. So read it over, and we'll see if we can take a vote for a minute on what do you think is the right answer there. Okay, so what do you think? Okay, the first statement says if Blake is happy, then he is playing bridge. The second one says if Blake is playing bridge, then he's happy. The third one says if Blake is not happy, then he's not playing bridge. Who thinks that the first one is the inverse? A one? Who thinks the second one is the inverse? Okay, I got about 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 or so. How many think the last one is the inverse? Okay, the second one had the most. So, let's see if they're right. And they are brilliant. You're brilliant. Because when you make the inverse, it's the opposite. So if he's not playing bridge, the opposite would be that he is playing bridge. So you're just making it the opposite. That's all you're doing. What is the converse? If Jim will read an essay, then it's printed in the font's Webdings, I guess. So we want to flip it around. If it's printed on Webdings, then Jim will read it. Is that one? That would be converse. Okay, so just a little bit of practice there.